Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Blackwood, retired Army intelligence officer, stood in the archives of the Louisiana Historical Society on a humid September morning in 2024, examining documents that had been sealed for 170 years. She was 68 years old, with silver hair pulled back in a military bun and eyes that had seen too much in 3 decades of service. She'd spent the last 5 years researching her family history, and the trail had led her here, to these newly unsealed records from the Riverside Plantation in St. Charles Parish. Sarah had been told repeatedly by other historians that her family's oral history was exaggerated. Her grandmother had spoken of a mysterious rule on the plantation where her ancestors had been enslaved, a rule so terrifying that no one dared break it, even at the cost of their own lives. A rule that was never written down, never explained to outsiders, but followed absolutely by every enslaved person on the property. Most historians dismissed it as folklore. Enslaved people often created myths about their enslavers to explain their fear, one professor had told Sarah condescendingly. Your grandmother's stories are probably based on misunderstood events or exaggerated to make the horror of slavery more comprehensible to children. But Sarah had learned something in Army intelligence: when everyone tells the same story with the same specific details across multiple generations, there's usually truth underneath it. The archivist, a young woman named Michelle, brought Sarah the final box of Riverside Plantation records. These were sealed by court order in 1854, Michelle explained. The Riverside family, who owned the plantation, requested the seal, and the court granted it. The records only became public this year when the 170-year seal expired. Sarah opened the box carefully. Inside were account books, correspondence, legal documents, and something that made her breath catch, a journal kept by the plantation owner, Robert Riverside, from 1848 to 1854. She opened the journal to the first page and began reading. January 1st, 1848, I write this journal knowing it must be sealed after my death. What I have done at Riverside Plantation is necessary, but it cannot be publicly known. The rule must be maintained, but the reason for it must remain hidden. If the truth were revealed, I would be destroyed, my family would be ruined, and the careful order I have established would collapse. The enslaved people know the rule. They follow it absolutely, without exception, though I have never explained why. They believe I am cruel and capricious. They believe the rule exists to torment them. They do not know that the rule is the only thing keeping them alive. I carry this burden alone. God forgive me for what I have done and what I must continue to do. Sarah felt ice in her veins. This was it, confirmation that the mysterious rule was real, that it had a hidden purpose, and that Robert Riverside had deliberately kept it secret. She continued reading, looking for specifics about the rule itself. It took several pages before she found it. February 3, 1848, Samuel attempted to break the rule today. He did not know, could not know, that breaking the rule would endanger everyone on the plantation. I had no choice. I had him taken to the whipping post and gave him 20 lashes in front of all the others. It was brutal, and I hated myself for it, but they must be made to fear breaking the rule more than they fear the punishment. Samuel screamed. The others watched in horror. Afterwards, my wife Margaret asked me why I was so harsh for such a minor infraction. I could not tell her the truth. I can tell no one the truth. The rule seems arbitrary. No enslaved person may ever go near the old cabin at the edge of the woods. No one may approach within 100 feet. No one may speak about it or ask questions about it. No exceptions. To them, it appears to be senseless cruelty, punishing them for approaching an abandoned building for no reason. But if they knew what was in that cabin, if they knew what I am hiding there, they would understand that the rule protects them as much as it protects me. Sarah's heart raced. What was in the cabin? Why would going near it endanger everyone? She spent hours reading through Robert Riverside's journal, piecing together a story that grew increasingly disturbing. The entries were cryptic, written in code or vague references, but patterns emerged. March 15, 1848, supplies delivered to the cabin last night. Margaret asked what I was doing, walking through the woods after midnight. I told her I was checking on equipment. She suspects something, but she does not ask questions. Perhaps she does not want to know. The arrangement continues. As long as no one approaches the cabin, as long as the rule is followed, everyone remains safe. But the danger is real. One mistake, one broken rule, and everything could be exposed. June 22, 1848, young Mary, only 8 years old, chased a chicken toward the cabin. She came within 50 feet before I saw her and shouted for her to stop. The terror in my voice frightened her so badly she ran crying to her mother. I had to punish her, 10 lashes with a light whip, enough to leave marks but not injure seriously. The other enslaved people hate me for it. They think I am a monster who beats children for trivial offenses. They do not know I am protecting her from something far worse than a whipping. Sarah found correspondence from 1849 between Robert Riverside and his brother Thomas, who lived in Virginia. Brother Thomas. I received your letter asking about the rumors you have heard regarding my plantation. You ask if it is true that I have established a strange rule forbidding enslaved people from approaching a certain area of my property, and that I punish violations with unusual severity. The rumors are true, though the reasons are not what people suppose. I cannot explain in writing what I have discovered, what I am hiding, and why the rule is necessary. But I assure you, brother, that if you understood the situation, you would agree that the rule must be enforced absolutely, regardless of how cruel it appears. I live with constant fear that someone will break the rule and discover what I am concealing. And I live with guilt for the punishments I must inflict to maintain the fear that keeps people away from the cabin. This burden is mine alone to carry. Pray for me, brother, though I do not deserve your prayers. Robert. Sarah found testimony from enslaved people, recorded years later after the Civil War by Union officers documenting conditions on Louisiana plantations. Several people who'd been enslaved at Riverside spoke about the mysterious rule. Testimony of Moses, age 47, formerly enslaved at Riverside Plantation. There was a rule on Riverside that made no sense to any of us. Master Riverside had an old cabin at the edge of the woods, falling apart, looked abandoned. But no one was allowed to go near it. Not within 100 feet, he said. If you got close, even by accident, you got whipped. A woman named Sarah once went near the cabin chasing her toddler who'd wandered that direction. Master Riverside saw her, dragged her back, and gave her 15 lashes in front of everyone. Her child was crying, she was screaming, and all we could do was watch. And for what? For getting near an old empty cabin? We all thought Master Riverside was crazy or just cruel for no reason. But after the war, after we were freed and Master Riverside was dead, some of us went to that cabin to see what was in it that made him so fierce about keeping us away. What we found. I still have nightmares about it. Sarah felt her hands shaking. She needed to know what was in the cabin. She flipped through more documents, looking for answers. She found them in a letter dated 1854, written by Robert Riverside to his lawyer, marked, confidential, to be sealed after my death. Mr. Harrison. As my attorney and friend, you must know the truth about Riverside Plantation, though I beg you to keep this sealed as long as the law allows. In 1847, I purchased what I thought was unclaimed land adjacent to my plantation. I planned to expand my rice fields. While surveying the land, I discovered the old cabin. Inside, I found something that has haunted me every day since. The cabin was not abandoned. It was being used. And what I found, there was evidence of a crime so terrible that revealing it would have destroyed multiple prominent Louisiana families, including to my horror, my own. I found documents proving that the cabin had been used as a location for the illegal smuggling of enslaved people into Louisiana after the international slave trade was banned in 1808. But worse than that, I found evidence that the people being smuggled were not coming from Africa. They were free black people from northern states, kidnapped and brought south to be sold as slaves. The documents included names of the kidnappers, names of the purchasers, locations, dates, and prices. My own father's name was on these documents. My father, who I believed to be an honorable man, had been part of a kidnapping and smuggling operation that had destroyed hundreds of lives. But the most horrifying discovery was that the cabin was still in use in 1847. The smuggling operation was still active. And if I reported it, I would expose not only my father's crimes but also current criminal operations involving some of the most powerful families in Louisiana. I made a choice that has damned my soul. I decided to hide the evidence rather than report it. I moved the documents to a secure location within the cabin. I established the rule forbidding anyone from approaching the cabin. And I enforced that rule with violence that made me appear cruel and irrational. But I had a reason. The people still running the smuggling operation discovered that I knew about the cabin. They threatened me. They said if I revealed what I knew, they would kill every enslaved person on my plantation, quietly, over time, making it look like accidents or illness. They said they had done it before on other plantations when someone threatened to expose them. They gave me a choice: keep the secret and enforce the rule keeping people away from the evidence, or watch everyone on my property die. I chose to keep the secret. I chose to appear cruel rather than risk mass murder. I established the rule and enforced it brutally because as long as no enslaved person approached the cabin, as long as no one discovered the documents, the smugglers would leave my plantation alone. For 7 years, I have lived with this choice. I have whipped people for approaching an abandoned cabin. I have punished children for innocent mistakes. I have let my enslaved workers believe I am a monster who inflicts pain for arbitrary reasons. And all of this, all of the suffering I have caused, has been to prevent something worse. Because if the smugglers believed I had lost control of my plantation, if they thought the evidence might be discovered, they would massacre everyone to eliminate witnesses and hide their crimes. Mr. Harrison, when I die, this journal must be sealed. The evidence in the cabin must be secured. And someday, when enough time has passed that the men running the smuggling operation are dead and cannot retaliate, the truth must be revealed. I do not expect forgiveness. I have caused terrible suffering trying to prevent worse suffering. I have chosen to appear evil to hide from greater evil. History will judge me harshly, and I deserve that judgment. But I beg you, let the truth eventually be known. Let it be understood that the mysterious rule, the senseless punishments, the inexplicable cruelty were not sadism. They were the desperate actions of a man trying to protect people while hiding evidence of crimes he could not safely expose. May God forgive me, though I cannot forgive myself. Robert Riverside. March 1854 Sarah sat back, stunned. The mysterious rule that her grandmother had spoken of, that had been enforced with brutal violence for 7 years, had been Robert Riverside's desperate attempt to protect enslaved people from mass murder while hiding evidence of kidnapping and illegal slave smuggling. But Sarah had more questions. What happened to the evidence? What happened to the smuggling operation? And why had the records been sealed for 170 years? She found the answer in the final documents in the box, court records from 1854. Robert Riverside died in April 1854 at age 46. In his will, he left instructions for his attorney to retrieve the documents from the cabin and present them to federal authorities, along with his journal explaining the situation. The attorney did as instructed. The documents were recovered and presented to a federal judge. What they revealed was explosive, a kidnapping and smuggling operation that had been running for decades, involving prominent planters, slave traders, and even some government officials. But when the judge reviewed the evidence, he made a calculated decision. Prosecuting the smuggling operation would require exposing the complicity of dozens of powerful families. It would create a massive scandal. It would raise uncomfortable questions about how many enslaved people in Louisiana were actually free people who'd been kidnapped. The judge ordered the evidence sealed for 170 years. The smuggling operation was quietly shut down through private threats and negotiations. The families involved were never publicly exposed. And Robert Riverside's journal, explaining the mysterious rule and why he'd enforced it so brutally, was sealed along with the other documents. The enslaved people on Riverside Plantation never learned the truth. They lived their entire lives believing Robert Riverside had been a cruel, capricious man who punished them for arbitrary reasons. They never knew he'd been trying to protect them. They never knew the rule had a hidden purpose. Sarah closed the journal with tears streaming down her face. Her grandmother's stories were true. The mysterious rule was real. And the reason behind it was even more complex and tragic than anyone had imagined. Robert Riverside had caused real suffering to prevent theoretical greater suffering. He'd appeared evil to hide evidence of worse evil. He'd let himself be hated rather than risk mass murder. But he'd also been complicit in hiding a kidnapping operation. He'd protected his father's reputation over justice. He'd chosen to punish enslaved people rather than expose powerful criminals. Sarah didn't know whether Robert Riverside deserved condemnation or sympathy. Probably both. But she knew one thing: this story needed to be told. The mysterious rule that her grandmother had spoken of, that historians had dismissed as folklore, was real and documented. And the hidden purpose behind it revealed the impossible moral complexity that people faced within the evil system of slavery. Sarah began photographing the documents, knowing she was about to write the most important historical paper of her career. But as she worked, she received a phone call that made her blood run cold. "Dr. Blackwood? This is Harrison Riverside IV. I'm a descendant of Robert Riverside. I understand you're examining my ancestors' sealed records. I need to speak with you immediately about what you plan to do with what you found." His voice was tense, almost threatening. And Sarah realized, the story wasn't over. The descendants of the families implicated in the smuggling operation were still powerful, still protecting their ancestors' reputations. And they would not want this truth revealed. Sarah was about to discover that some secrets, even 170 years old, still have the power to destroy. Sarah agreed to meet Harrison Riverside IV at a coffee shop near the Historical Society. He arrived exactly on time, a man in his 50s, expensive suit, the kind of person who was used to being obeyed. He sat down across from Sarah with an expression that was carefully neutral but couldn't hide the tension underneath. "Dr. Blackwood, I'll be direct. My family has known for generations that Robert Riverside's records would become unsealed in 2024. We've been concerned about what they might contain and how they might be interpreted." "Concerned?" Sarah kept her voice level, drawing on decades of military experience dealing with hostile interrogations. "Your ancestor documented a kidnapping and smuggling operation that destroyed hundreds of lives. Multiple prominent families were involved. That's not interpretation, that's fact." Harrison's jaw tightened. Robert Riverside was trying to protect people. He was put in an impossible situation. If you publish his records without context, you'll make him look like a monster when he was actually trying to prevent mass murder. He was also covering up crimes. He hid evidence of kidnapping free black people. He protected his father's reputation over justice. He was surviving in a system where exposing the truth would have gotten everyone on his plantation killed. "Dr. Blackwood, you were in military intelligence. Surely you understand that sometimes good people have to make terrible choices in impossible situations. Sarah leaned forward. I also understand that powerful people often hide behind impossible situations to avoid accountability for complicity in evil. Your ancestor caused real suffering, Mr. Riverside. People were whipped for getting near a cabin. Children were beaten for innocent mistakes. All to hide evidence of crimes that should have been prosecuted. And if he'd revealed that evidence, every enslaved person on his plantation would have been murdered. The smugglers made that clear. What would you have done in his situation? I don't know, Sarah admitted. But that's not the point. The point is that this history has been hidden for 170 years. My grandmother's family stories were dismissed as exaggeration. The mysterious rule was treated as folklore. And all of that dismissal was because your family and others wanted this scandal buried. Harrison was quiet for a moment, then spoke more softly. Dr. Blackwood, I'm not here to threaten you. But I am here to ask you to think carefully about how you present this information. Multiple families, not just mine, will be implicated in that smuggling operation. Some of those families are still prominent in Louisiana. This will destroy reputations, damage businesses, cause real harm to living people who had nothing to do with what happened 170 years ago. And my ancestors lived their entire lives believing they'd been punished for arbitrary reasons, never knowing the truth. They died thinking Robert Riverside was simply cruel. Don't their descendants deserve to know the real story? Even if that story is more complicated than evil slave owner versus innocent victims. Even if it shows that your ancestor was complicit in hiding crimes. Especially then, Sarah said firmly. History is complicated. People made impossible choices within evil systems. But that complexity doesn't mean we hide the truth. It means we tell it completely and honestly. Harrison pulled out a folder. I brought something. Letters written by enslaved people from Riverside Plantation after the war. They were interviewed about Robert Riverside after emancipation. I want you to read what they said. Sarah took the folder and read. The letters were testimonies recorded in 1865 to 1866 by Union officers. Testimony of Rachel, age 52, formerly enslaved at Riverside Plantation. Master Riverside was hard about that cabin. Real hard. He whipped people for getting close to it, even by accident. We all thought he was crazy or cruel. But I'll tell you something else about Master Riverside, he never sold anyone. Not once in all the years I was there. Other plantations, they'd sell your children, sell your husband, sell you away from everything you knew. But Master Riverside kept families together. He said it was because it was more efficient, but I think it was because he couldn't bear to separate people. And Master Riverside's plantation was one of the few where enslaved people could learn to read. He looked the other way when we taught each other. He never stopped us. He pretended not to know, but he knew. I'm not saying Master Riverside was good. No one who owns people is good. But he was complicated. He was hard about some things and unexpectedly soft about others. I never understood it until after the war, when I heard rumors about what was in that cabin. Then I started to wonder if maybe there was a reason for the rule that we didn't know about. Sarah read through several more testimonies. They painted a complex picture. Robert Riverside had been brutal about enforcing the rule regarding the cabin, but unusually lenient in other areas. He'd kept families together when most plantations routinely separated them. He'd allowed literacy when it was illegal and dangerous. He'd provided better food and medical care than most enslaved people received. What do you want me to do with this? Sarah asked Harrison. I want you to tell the complete story. Not just that Robert Riverside enforced a mysterious cruel rule, but why he did it and what else he did to mitigate the harm he was causing. I want you to acknowledge that he was trapped in an impossible situation. And the families implicated in the smuggling operation? What about them? Harrison's expression hardened. Some of those families will fight you if you expose them. They have money and lawyers. They'll claim the documents are unreliable, that Robert's testimony is self-serving, that you're sensationalizing history for attention. Let them try, Sarah said coldly. I've faced hostile actors in Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm not intimidated by wealthy families protecting their reputations. Dr. Blackwood, I'm not threatening you. I'm warning you. These families have spent 170 years burying this story. They won't give up easily. Sarah stood up. Neither will I. Thank you for the testimonies, Mr. Riverside. I'll include them in my research. But I'm going to tell the complete truth, the smuggling operation, your ancestors' complicity in hiding it, the impossible choices he faced, and the suffering he caused. All of it. Harrison nodded slowly. I expected nothing less. And Dr. Blackwood? For what it's worth, I think you're right. The truth should be told, even if it damages my family's reputation. We've hidden behind that sealed record for too long. Over the next 6 months, Sarah conducted the most thorough investigation of her career. She tracked down every document related to the Riverside Plantation and the mysterious rule. She interviewed descendants of people who'd been enslaved there. She consulted with legal historians about the smuggling operation. And she faced resistance. 3 of the families implicated in the smuggling operation sent lawyers threatening lawsuits if Sarah published defamatory claims about their ancestors based on questionable evidence. Sarah's response was to document everything even more thoroughly. She found customs records showing unexplained movements of cargo that matched the smuggling operation's timeline. She found newspaper reports from northern cities about free black people who disappeared and were never found. She found correspondence between the smugglers discussing their operation in coded language. The evidence was overwhelming. The smuggling operation had been real, had operated for decades, and had kidnapped hundreds of free people into slavery. But Sarah also found something else, evidence that the operation had been shut down in 1854 after Robert Riverside's death, when his attorney presented the evidence to federal authorities. While the judge had sealed the records to avoid scandal, he'd also quietly prosecuted several of the smugglers under different charges, effectively ending the operation without public exposure. The mysterious rule that Robert Riverside had enforced so brutally had protected not just the enslaved people on his plantation but potentially hundreds of others. Once the operation was shut down, no more free people were kidnapped through that network. Sarah presented her findings to a symposium of historians in New Orleans in March 2025. The presentation was titled The Mysterious Rule, Complexity, Complicity, and Impossible Choices in Antebellum Louisiana. She stood before a packed auditorium and began. My grandmother told me stories when I was a child. Stories about her great-grandmother who'd been enslaved on a plantation where there was a mysterious rule. A rule that made no sense. A rule that was enforced with brutal violence. A rule that everyone followed absolutely because breaking it meant severe punishment. For years, historians told me these stories were folklore. Exaggeration. Misremembered events turned into myth. But I'm a retired Army intelligence officer, and I learned something in 30 years of service. When multiple sources tell the same story with the same specific details, there's usually truth underneath. I was right. The mysterious rule was real. And the truth behind it is more complex, more tragic, and more morally complicated than anyone imagined. Sarah presented the evidence methodically: Robert Riverside's journal, the documents from the cabin, the testimony from enslaved people, the evidence of the smuggling operation. She explained the impossible choice Robert had faced: expose the crime and risk mass murder of everyone on his plantation, or hide the evidence and enforce the rule through violence that made him appear cruel. Robert Riverside caused real suffering, Sarah said clearly. People were whipped for approaching an abandoned cabin. Children were beaten for innocent mistakes. Families lived in fear of arbitrary punishment. That suffering was real, and it matters. But Riverside was also trying to prevent worse suffering. He was hiding evidence that, if discovered, would have resulted in the murder of dozens of people. He was trapped between two evil choices: appear cruel and punish people to maintain the rule, or risk mass murder. This doesn't excuse what he did. It doesn't make the suffering he caused acceptable. But it does add necessary complexity to our understanding of how people navigated the evil system of slavery. And here's what historians have missed for 170 years: the enslaved people on Riverside Plantation never knew the truth. They lived and died believing Riverside was simply a cruel, capricious man. They never knew the rule had a hidden purpose. They never knew he was trying to protect them. My grandmother's great-grandmother died believing she'd been punished arbitrarily. She never knew the full story. And that ignorance, that inability to understand the context of your own suffering, that's another form of cruelty that slavery inflicted. Sarah paused, looking out at the audience. Some of you will want to paint Robert Riverside as a hero who sacrificed his reputation to protect people. Others will want to condemn him as complicit in hiding terrible crimes. The truth is he was both and neither. He was a man trapped in an evil system, making impossible choices, causing real harm while trying to prevent worse harm. The mysterious rule wasn't arbitrary cruelty. But it was cruel. It had a hidden purpose. But that purpose required suffering. It protected people. But it also protected criminals. History is messy. People are complicated. And sometimes the truth is that there were no good choices, only choices that were less terrible than the alternatives. The presentation sparked intense debate. Some historians praised Sarah's nuanced approach. Others accused her of being too sympathetic to Robert Riverside. Some descendants of enslaved people thanked her for validating their family stories. Others felt she was excusing violence by explaining its context. But everyone agreed on one thing: the story needed to be told completely and honestly. 3 weeks after the symposium, Sarah received a letter from an unexpected source. It was from Patricia Riverside, Harrison Riverside's cousin, part of the family but someone who'd taken a different approach. Dr. Blackwood. My cousin Harrison met with you last year to discuss our ancestor Robert Riverside's records. I want to thank you for telling the complete story despite pressure from our family and others to hide or minimize the truth. I've spent my life carrying shame about my family's involvement in slavery. We were taught that Robert Riverside was a good man doing his best in a bad system. Finding out that he was hiding evidence of a kidnapping operation, that makes the shame worse. But your presentation helped me understand something: shame and pride aren't the only options when dealing with difficult ancestral history. We can acknowledge complexity. We can honor the good things people did while condemning the bad. We can understand impossible choices while still holding people accountable for the choices they made. Robert Riverside enforced a cruel rule to prevent mass murder. Both of those things are true. He hid evidence of crimes to protect his father's reputation and his own safety. That's also true. He kept families together and allowed literacy when most plantation owners didn't. Also true. All of it is true. And acknowledging all of it is the only way to honestly reckon with our history. Thank you for refusing to simplify a complicated story. Thank you for validating the family stories that descendants of enslaved people preserved for generations. And thank you for showing that complexity doesn't mean excusing evil, it means understanding it fully so we can learn from it. My family is establishing a foundation with an initial endowment of $2 million to support research into hidden histories of slavery and to provide resources for descendants researching their family stories. We're naming it the Grace Foundation, after your grandmother whose stories you refuse to let historians dismiss. We can't undo what our ancestors did. But we can face the truth about it. And we can support efforts to uncover more truths that have been hidden. With respect and gratitude. Patricia Riverside. Sarah kept that letter on her desk as she continued her research. Over the next year, she helped dozens of people research their family histories, applying the same rigorous methodology she'd used to uncover the truth about the mysterious rule. And she began writing a book, The Mysterious Rule, One Plantation, One Hidden Purpose, and 170 Years of Secrets. The book was published in 2026 and became a bestseller. It told the complete story, the smuggling operation, Robert Riverside's impossible choice, the enforcement of the cruel rule, the testimonies from enslaved people, and the 170 years of hiding the truth. But the book also told Sarah's story, a retired military officer who'd been told her grandmother's stories were folklore, who'd spent years being dismissed by historians, who'd finally proved the stories true through persistent investigation. I was underestimated because I was taking family stories seriously instead of dismissing them as myth, Sarah wrote in the introduction. I was told I was wasting my time, that oral histories from enslaved communities weren't reliable, that I should focus on real documentation. But I learned something in Army intelligence that applies to historical research. The absence of written documentation doesn't mean something didn't happen. It often means someone worked hard to hide it. And when communities preserve the same stories across generations with specific consistent details, those stories deserve serious investigation. My grandmother's stories were true. The mysterious rule was real. And uncovering the truth behind it reveals the impossible moral complexity that people navigated within the evil system of slavery. This complexity doesn't excuse slavery, nothing can excuse slavery. But it does help us understand how people survived it, resisted it, and tried to navigate it in ways that sometimes required causing harm to prevent worse harm. The mysterious rule that no one dared break, at any cost, wasn't arbitrary cruelty. But it was cruel. It had a hidden purpose. But that purpose required suffering. It protected people. But it also protected criminals. All of these contradictions are true. And facing them honestly is the only way to truly understand our history and learn from it. The book sparked renewed interest in hidden histories and oral traditions from enslaved communities. Universities began taking family stories more seriously as historical sources. Researchers started investigating other, mysterious, practices on plantations, looking for hidden purposes behind seemingly arbitrary cruelty. And Sarah continued her work, helping others uncover truths that had been buried, validating family stories that had been dismissed, and proving that persistence and rigorous investigation could reveal secrets that powerful people had spent generations trying to hide. The mysterious rule had been explained. The hidden purpose had been revealed. And the impossible moral complexity of slavery had been acknowledged in all its uncomfortable truth. Justice, historical justice, had been served. Not by simplifying the past, but by facing its full complexity. Not by choosing between condemning or excusing, but by acknowledging that sometimes people faced impossible choices within evil systems. And Sarah Blackwood, the retired Army officer who'd been told she was chasing folklore, had proved that truth matters, even when it's complicated, even when it's uncomfortable, and even when powerful people don't want it told. Sarah's book had been out for 6 months when she received an email that would open an entirely new chapter in the story. It came from a woman named Dr. Keisha Williams, a forensic anthropologist at Tulane University. Dr. Blackwood. I read your book about the mysterious rule at Riverside Plantation. I'm contacting you because I believe we may have found something that adds a crucial dimension to your research. 3 months ago, during an archaeological survey for a commercial development project, we discovered human remains on what used to be the edge of the Riverside Plantation property. The remains are of at least 17 individuals, buried in a mass grave, dating from approximately 1847 to 1848. All of the individuals show signs of violent death, bullet wounds, blunt force trauma to the skull, evidence of being killed and buried quickly without ceremony. Dr. Blackwood, I think we may have found evidence of what Robert Riverside was truly afraid of. I think we found victims of the smuggling operation, people who were killed when they became liabilities or when something went wrong. Would you be willing to consult on this investigation? Dr. Keisha Williams. Sarah drove to New Orleans the next day. At the excavation site, Dr. Williams showed her what they'd found, a mass grave containing the remains of 17 people, men, women, and children, all killed violently between 1847 and 1848. The timing matches the period when Robert Riverside discovered the cabin and the smuggling operation, Dr. Williams explained. And the location, this was on the very edge of his property, near where the cabin would have been located. Sarah looked at the excavation, feeling sick. You think these are victims of the smuggling operation? I think these might be people who were killed to silence them. Maybe they were witnesses to the smuggling. Maybe they were victims who tried to escape. Maybe they were smugglers who became liabilities. But Dr. Blackwood, 17 people were murdered and buried in a mass grave right near where Robert Riverside discovered evidence of the smuggling operation. And if he'd reported what he found, the smugglers would have killed everyone on his plantation to eliminate witnesses and hide their crimes, Dr. Williams finished. Just like they threatened. This mass grave proves they were willing to commit mass murder. Sarah helped Dr. Williams with the investigation over the next months. DNA analysis was conducted on the remains. Forensic anthropologists examined the bones for clues about the victims' identities and origins. The results were devastating. Of the 17 victims, 9 could be identified through DNA matches to living descendants. All 9 had been free black people from northern states, Pennsylvania, New York, Massachusetts, who disappeared between 1847 and 1848 and were never found. They'd been kidnapped, brought to Louisiana, and when something went wrong, when they tried to escape, or when they became too much of a risk, they'd been murdered and buried in a mass grave. This proves what Robert Riverside feared was real, Dr. Williams said as they reviewed the findings. These smugglers were willing to kill anyone who threatened to expose them. If Riverside had reported what he found, if enslaved people on his plantation had discovered the evidence in the cabin, the smugglers would have massacred everyone. Sarah thought about this discovery and what it meant for understanding Robert Riverside's choices. He'd been cruel in enforcing the mysterious rule. He'd whipped people, punished children, caused real suffering. But he'd done it knowing that failure to keep people away from the cabin would result in mass murder, because he'd seen evidence that the smugglers were willing to commit mass murder. But Sarah also realized something else. This discovery needed to be shared with the descendants of people who'd been enslaved at Riverside Plantation. They deserved to know the complete story. Sarah organized a gathering in New Orleans, inviting descendants of enslaved people from Riverside Plantation along with Dr. Williams and other researchers. About 40 people came, elderly people who'd heard family stories, middle-aged people researching their history, young people trying to understand their heritage. Sarah stood before them and presented the findings, the mysterious rule, Robert Riverside's journal, the smuggling operation, the testimonies from enslaved people, and now the mass grave proving the smugglers' willingness to kill. An elderly man named James spoke up. My great-great-grandmother was Rachel. She was enslaved at Riverside. She told her children about being whipped for chasing a chicken too close to that cabin. She never understood why. She died thinking she'd been punished for no reason. I'm sorry she never knew the truth, Sarah said. The rule did have a purpose, a hidden purpose that Robert Riverside couldn't reveal without endangering everyone. But that doesn't change the fact that your great-great-grandmother suffered without understanding why. That's a particular cruelty that slavery inflicted, suffering without even the dignity of knowing the reason. A woman named Cheryl raised her hand. Dr. Blackwood, you're asking us to feel sorry for Robert Riverside because he faced an impossible choice. But he still owned people. He still caused suffering. Why should we care that he felt guilty about it? You shouldn't, Sarah said firmly. And I'm not asking you to. I'm not asking you to forgive Robert Riverside or to feel sorry for him. I'm asking you to understand the complete truth about what happened, not to excuse it, but to understand it. Your ancestors were brave and strong. They survived slavery. They preserved their stories. They passed down the truth that there was a mysterious rule, even when historians dismissed those stories as folklore. You honored them by preserving those stories. And now we know they were telling the truth. James spoke again. But knowing the truth doesn't undo what happened. My great-great-grandmother was still whipped. She still suffered. She still died without understanding why. You're right, Sarah agreed. The truth doesn't undo the harm. But it does honor your ancestors by taking their stories seriously, by validating what they experienced, and by refusing to let their suffering be dismissed or forgotten. The group discussion continued for hours. People shared family stories, talked about how they'd been dismissed by historians, expressed anger and pain about ancestral trauma, and grappled with the moral complexity of Robert Riverside's choices. At the end, Cheryl approached Sarah. Dr. Blackwood, I want to thank you for not simplifying this story. It would have been easier to just say, evil slave owner enforced cruel rule. That's what we expect from these stories. But you insisted on the complicated truth, even when it was uncomfortable. The complicated truth is harder, Sarah agreed. But it's more honest. And your ancestors deserve honesty. Can I ask you something? As a black woman, how do you feel about Robert Riverside? Do you think he was trying to do the right thing? Sarah thought carefully before answering. I think he was trying to choose the least terrible option in an impossible situation within an evil system. I think he caused real suffering. I think he hid evidence of terrible crimes. I think he protected his father's reputation over justice. And I think he may have prevented mass murder by enforcing that cruel rule. All of those things are true. And I can't tell you how to feel about him. That's something each person has to decide for themselves based on the complete evidence. Cheryl nodded. I think I can be angry at him for the suffering he caused and also acknowledge that he was trapped in a terrible situation. Both things can be true. Yes. Both things can be true. Over the next year, the mass grave discovery received national attention. The 9 identified victims' families were notified. Proper funerals were held. A memorial was established at the site. And Sarah continued uncovering the broader story of the smuggling operation. She found evidence of similar operations in other states. She helped identify more victims. She connected with other researchers investigating hidden histories of kidnapping and illegal enslavement. In 2027, Sarah was invited to testify before a congressional committee studying the legacy of slavery and the need for reparations. She brought the complete evidence, Robert Riverside's journal, the smuggling operation documents, testimony from enslaved people, and the forensic evidence from the mass grave. This story shows why historical reckoning is so complex, Sarah told the committee. Robert Riverside was a slave owner who caused suffering. He was also someone trying to prevent mass murder. He hid evidence of crimes. He also eventually ensured that evidence reached authorities and the smuggling operation was shut down. But here's what matters most, the enslaved people on his plantation suffered without knowing why. They were denied even the dignity of understanding the context of their pain. And they preserved the truth of that mysterious rule through generations of family stories that were dismissed as folklore. When we talk about reparations, we're not just talking about financial compensation. We're talking about validating the stories that Black families have preserved, taking oral histories seriously as legitimate historical sources, and acknowledging that descendants deserve to know the complete truth about their ancestors' experiences. My grandmother's stories were dismissed for decades. She died before I could prove they were true. That's a loss of validation, a loss of acknowledgement, a loss of historical justice that came too late. Reparations means making sure we don't keep dismissing these stories. It means investing in research that uncovers hidden truths. It means taking descendants' testimony seriously rather than requiring them to prove their family histories against skeptical historians. The mysterious rule at Riverside Plantation was real. The suffering it caused was real. The complex motivations behind it were real. All of it matters. All of it deserves to be acknowledged and studied and understood. Sarah's testimony received widespread attention. It sparked renewed discussions about how to research and teach the history of slavery, about the value of oral histories, and about the need for complexity rather than simplification. But the most meaningful response came from James, the descendant of Rachel who'd been whipped for chasing a chicken. He wrote Sarah a letter. Dr. Blackwood. I've been thinking about my great-great-grandmother Rachel a lot since your presentation. She suffered without understanding why. She died believing she'd been punished arbitrarily. And that suffering mattered, it was real and it hurt her and it affected her family for generations. But now I understand why. And even though that understanding doesn't undo her suffering, it gives it meaning. It shows she wasn't punished because she was worthless or because her enslaver was randomly cruel. She was punished because of a complicated situation involving kidnapping and smuggling and threats of mass murder. That doesn't make the punishment okay. But it makes it different than meaningless cruelty. And more than that, her story was preserved. My family told that story for 5 generations. We kept it alive even when historians said it was folklore. And you proved we were right to keep telling it. That's a different kind of victory. Not the victory of being spared suffering, but the victory of having our truth validated, our stories believed, our family history acknowledged as legitimate history rather than myth. So thank you. Thank you for taking family stories seriously. Thank you for refusing to simplify a complicated truth. Thank you for proving that my great-great-grandmother's experience mattered and deserves to be remembered exactly as she described it, mysterious, inexplicable, and enforced with absolute brutality. The rule no slave dared to break, at any cost, was real. Now we know why. And that matters. With gratitude. James. Sarah kept that letter framed on her office wall. It reminded her why historical research mattered, not just to understand the past, but to validate the people who lived through it and the descendants who preserved their stories. In 2028, on the 180th anniversary of the mysterious rule being established at Riverside Plantation, a memorial ceremony was held at the site. It honored both the victims of the smuggling operation found in the mass grave and the enslaved people who'd lived under the mysterious rule. Sarah spoke at the ceremony. 180 years ago, a man named Robert Riverside established a rule that made no sense to anyone who lived under it. For 7 years, that rule was enforced with brutal violence. People suffered without understanding why. For 170 years after that, the reason for the rule was hidden, sealed by court order, buried in archives, dismissed as folklore when families tried to tell the truth about it. Today, we acknowledge the complete story. The suffering was real. The hidden purpose was real. The impossible moral choices were real. All of it matters. None of it cancels out the rest. We honor the victims of the smuggling operation, 17 people murdered and buried in a mass grave, 9 of whom we've now identified and returned to their families for proper burial. We honor the enslaved people who lived under the mysterious rule, who suffered punishment they didn't understand, who preserved the truth through family stories, who maintained their dignity despite cruelty. And we acknowledge that historical truth is complex. That people in evil systems faced impossible choices. That understanding those choices doesn't excuse the evil but does help us comprehend how people survived it and sometimes tried to resist it in ways that required causing harm to prevent worse harm. The mysterious rule has been explained. But the suffering it caused cannot be undone. We can only acknowledge it, learn from it, and commit to never forgetting the people who lived through it. The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a memorial stone that read, "The Mysterious Rule, 1847–1854. Here stood Riverside Plantation, where enslaved people lived under a rule. They were forbidden to question and punished brutally for breaking the rule, never approach the old cabin at the edge of the woods. For 7 years, people suffered without understanding why. They were whipped for innocent mistakes. They were punished for accidents. They believed they were victims of arbitrary cruelty. The truth was more complex asterisk. The cabin held evidence of a kidnapping and smuggling operation. The enslaver who established the rule was threatened with mass murder. If the evidence was discovered, he chose to appear cruel rather than risk everyone's death. This does not excuse the suffering he caused. It does not justify the violence. It explains it, and explanation is not the same as excuse. We honor the enslaved people who suffered under this rule. We honor the victims of the smuggling operation buried nearby. We honor the families who preserved these stories for generations. Even when they were dismissed as folklore. We acknowledge that history is complex. That people faced impossible choices within evil systems. That understanding those choices helps us learn. But does not undo the harm they caused. May the suffering be remembered. May the truth be told completely. May justice, delayed but real, finally be served. Sarah stood before the memorial, thinking about the journey that had led here, from her grandmother's stories that historians dismissed, through years of research proving those stories true, to discovering the hidden purpose behind the mysterious rule, and finally to this moment of public acknowledgement. She'd been underestimated for taking family stories seriously. She'd been told she was wasting her time on folklore. She'd faced resistance from families protecting their reputations and historians protecting conventional narratives. But she'd persisted. She'd applied military discipline to historical research. She'd refused to simplify complex truths. And she'd proved that stories preserved by descendants of enslaved people deserved to be taken seriously as legitimate historical sources. The mysterious rule that no slave on the plantation dared to break, at any cost, had finally been explained. The hidden purpose had been revealed. The impossible moral complexity had been acknowledged. And the descendants of people who'd suffered under that rule had received something precious, validation. Acknowledgement. Historical justice that came 170 years late but still mattered. Sarah looked out at the crowd, descendants of enslaved people, historians, forensic anthropologists, members of families once implicated in the smuggling operation who'd chosen to face truth rather than hide from it. All of them gathered to acknowledge a complicated truth that couldn't be simplified into heroes and villains, but had to be understood in all its painful complexity. That was justice. Imperfect. Delayed. But real. And Sarah Blackwood, the retired Army officer who'd refused to let her grandmother's stories be dismissed as folklore, had made it happen. The mysterious rule had been explained. The truth had been told. Justice had been served.